The weight of empty chairs. The Conclave of Varric was the oldest deliberative body in the known galaxy. It had been built 600 years ago in the hollow core of a dead asteroid, carved out by the Vithari, a species so ancient that their homeworld no longer had a name anyone could pronounce, only a set of coordinates whispered between archivists like something sacred. The chamber inside was enormous, circular, tiered. The seats rose in great curved arcs from the central floor the way the inside of a shell rises from its own center, smooth and inevitable. The walls were the color of deep water, faintly luminescent, and the air inside was cold and faintly sharp the way air gets when it has been recycled through systems that were built before any living being in the room was born. Ambassador Riva Selene had been inside the conclave chamber 5 times. Each time she had felt the weight of it, not the physical weight, but the other kind. The kind that comes from standing in a place where decisions have been made for centuries and understanding very clearly that none of those decisions were made with you in mind. She was the only human in the room. She stood on the podium of address, a flat, raised disc in the exact geometric center of the chamber floor. It was positioned so that every seat in the curving ring above could look down at whoever stood there. That was not an accident. Riva had read the architectural notes once, out of curiosity. The original Vithari designers had been very deliberate about sightlines. She had been standing there for 2.5 hours. No one had called her forward. No one had spoken her name. She stood with her hands at her sides, her coat pressed flat, her dark hair pulled back from her face. She had learned long ago that the way she held her body in this room was a kind of language. She spoke it carefully. Above her, in the highest seat of the chamber, elevated slightly above the rest as tradition demanded, sat Grand Arbiter Thesson Vrak of the Vithari. He was tall even by Vithari standards, with 4 long arms folded across his chest and skin the pale gray-green of old stone. He wore robes of dark silver that ran from his collar to the floor. His face was long and still, and when he finally spoke, his voice arrived in the chamber the way deep water arrives, slowly, from everywhere at once. He did not look at Riva when he began to read. The charges were formal, recorded. They had been prepared by the conclave's legal body over a period of 8 months, and Thesson read them with the precise care of someone who understood that precision was its own power. Humanity had established settlements in 22 star systems without filing territorial acknowledgement with the conclave. Humanity had declined 3 separate requests for military inspection of their vessel classes and weapon systems. Humanity, on 2 occasions, used active force to turn back conclave observation ships operating in what the conclave considered shared space. And humanity, this was the charge that had been debated longest, worded most carefully, displayed behavioral profiles consistent with what Vithari psychological doctrine called vethic soon, untranslatable precisely. The closest human approximation was something like dangerously unregulated feeling, too emotional, too reactive, too impossible to model. Riva had heard all of it before. She had written responses to these charges. She had sent them through proper channels, through diplomatic contacts, through the slow and patient machinery of interstellar communication. She had requested 3 private hearings. She had been granted none. Thesson read the vote. The lights came up one by one on the great board above the chamber floor. Each member civilization had a designated indicator, green for authorization, white for refusal. One by one, they lit green. 31 civilizations, 31 votes. The lights came fast, the way votes come when a room has already decided before it walked in. Riva watched the board. Her face was still. Her jaw was tight. 1 light went white. A single white light among 31 positions. It belonged to Delegate Osun of the Caelum, a small insectoid species from the outer rim of the explored galaxy. Osun was seated low in the chamber, near the floor. Her body was motionless, her compound eyes fixed straight ahead. She offered no explanation for her vote. No one asked for one. One position remained dark, an abstention. The indicator for Delegate Osun's neighboring seat, a young diplomat from the Ron Compact, simply did not illuminate at all. Thesson read the result without pausing. The Galactic Conclave of Varric had voted 29-1 with one abstention against authorizing a stabilization action against the human territories of the sole sovereignty and all affiliated colonial settlements. The phrase stabilization action had been chosen by the Conclave's Language Committee after 3 weeks of deliberation. It implied order being restored. It implied something temporary. It implied, most importantly, that this would not take long. 2 Vathari ceremonial guards moved toward the podium from opposite sides of the chamber floor. Reva was being dismissed. She stepped down from the disc. She walked toward the far doors of the chamber. Her footsteps made almost no sound on the polished stone. She did not run. She did not look back at the board. The doors opened and closed behind her. She was alone in the outer corridor. The light out here was warmer, amber rather than blue, and the hum of the station around her was the deep, constant hum of life support and structural integrity and all the invisible systems that kept something this large from simply flying apart. She stood still for a moment, just breathing. Then she reached into the inner pocket of her coat and took out a communicator. Small, black, unremarkable. She pressed it once. She spoke 3 words. Her voice was flat and even, the way a voice gets when it has already made peace with what it is saying. Tell Arkin now. She put the communicator away and walked. Back inside the chamber, the session moved forward. New agenda items were introduced. The light on the board reset. Grand Arbiter Thesson descended from his elevated seat and was replaced by a logistics coordinator who began outlining the first phase of what the Conclave was already calling, in its internal documents, in the quiet language of its staff, the correction. Fleet Commandant Dreth Savar of the Vathari Unified Armada was called to the floor. He was broad and heavy-plated, with the kind of build that came from decades of military service and a species that simply grew larger the older it got. He had dark external plates across his upper body and a military record that spanned 4 decades. He received the authorization order with a slight formal bow. His face showed nothing. In his experience, operations of this kind were simply work. On the upper observation deck of the station, above the chamber, in the long curved windows that looked out over the stars, Delegate Osun stood alone. She had come here directly after voting. She had not spoken to anyone. A young Caelum aide, newly assigned, still learning the rhythms of this work, came and stood beside her. The stars outside were very sharp, very still. The station's slow rotation made them appear to drift slightly, like lights reflected in moving water. The aide waited what he considered a respectful amount of time, then he spoke. "Delegate," he said quietly, "if I may ask, why did you vote against the resolution?" Osun did not answer immediately. The station turned. A distant star moved across the edge of the window. "I studied them," she said at last. Her voice was very dry, very even. "I studied the full record, everything the archive holds." The aide waited. "They have been at war with themselves for the entirety of their recorded history. They have poisoned their own water, burned their own cities, collapsed entire ecosystems on their own homeworld. They have come by multiple independent estimates within hours of ending their own species, more than once." She paused. "And they are still here." The aide frowned. "Delegate, that sounds like a reason to support the campaign, if they are so destructive." Osun turned from the window for the first time and looked at him directly. Her compound eyes were dark and very steady. "No," she said. "That is the reason the campaign will fail." She turned back to the stars. The conclave read their numbers, their vessel count, their territorial spread. They measured outputs. She was quiet for a moment. They did not ask what it cost that species to still be breathing. They did not ask what kind of thing survives everything it has done to itself. A soft sound, mandibles, quiet, almost to herself. I asked, I read the answer, and I voted accordingly. The aide had nothing to say to that. Osun watched the stars a while longer, then she walked away from the window without another word, her footsteps nearly silent on the polished floor. Far from the station, across transit corridors and dark distances and the cold, patient space between star systems, a tight beam signal was traveling at the edge of the speed that physics allowed. It carried 3 words. By the time it arrived, those words had already been decoded, already been read, already been understood. In a room deep inside a mountain range that humans had once called the Urals, in a facility built into bedrock 400 meters below the surface, a man named Arkan Voss set down his coffee, looked up at the operational display covering the far wall, and took a long breath. He did not look afraid. He looked like someone who had been waiting for a signal they always knew was coming. He reached for his headset. "All stations, we are active." The shape of a trap. Fleet Commandant Dreth Savar had fought in 14 campaigns across 4 decades of Vetheri military service. He had ended 11 of them in under a standard week. He was not, by nature, a man who worried. He assessed, he calculated, he moved. Worry was an inefficiency, and Savar had spent his career eliminating inefficiencies from his process the way a craftsman eliminates rough edges, patiently, methodically, without drama. Standing at the command bridge of his flagship, the unwavering Accord, surrounded by the quiet hum of a warship at full operational readiness, Savar reviewed the intelligence report on human military capability and felt something he would not have called boredom, but that walked very close to it. 94 combat vessels, most of them smaller than his standard patrol class. Their primary weapons were magnetic acceleration systems, effective in a certain range band, but loud, predictable, and easy to screen against. Their tactical doctrine, according to his analysts, relied heavily on individual initiative rather than centralized command, which the analysts noted as a significant structural weakness. Commands that depended on soldiers thinking for themselves failed in high-stress environments. Everyone knew this. The stabilization action was projected to require 14 days. Savar privately thought 10. He gave the order, and 420 warships entered faster-than-light transit in a formation so precise it had been described by his navigation staff as architectural. They traveled in 3 columns along a route his navigators had plotted using the most current intelligence on human fleet positions. The route led through the standard entry corridor into the Sol system, the most efficient path, the most defensible approach, the most logical choice by every measure his tactical systems could calculate. They dropped out of transit on schedule. They found nothing. The corridor was empty, not abandoned, empty. There was debris, but old debris. Satellite casings, dead relay stations, scattered metal fragments drifting in slow, undisturbed arcs, the kind of drift that accumulates over years, not hours. His sensors swept the corridor in every direction and returned the same answer each time. No fleet, no defensive line, no humans. Savar stood very still at the center of his bridge and said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, full sweep, secondary sensors, all vectors. His officers ran it again. The result was the same. "Hold formation," Savar said. "No advance." His second commander, Verok, looked at him. "Sir?" Savar did not respond. He was looking at the debris field on his display. He had seen debris used as a screen before, not left behind, placed. Old debris and new debris arranged to look indistinguishable. It was the kind of thing you did when you wanted someone to look at what you put there instead of where you put it. He was still forming the shape of that thought when the first human vessel appeared from the shadow of a large carbonite asteroid at the corridor's edge, moving fast and low, and opened fire. Then the second, then the third, then 12 more from directions his formation had considered already cleared. Admiral Arkin Voss was not watching from a safe distance. He was on the bridge of the command carrier KSNS Endurance, positioned inside the asteroid belt itself. The belt his navigators had spent 11 months mapping into something that functioned less like an obstacle and more like a weapon. Every gravitational lane, every shadow pocket, every predictable drift corridor had been cataloged, memorized, and integrated into a tactical framework that his senior strategist, Commander Liat Bren, had built from first principles. Bren stood beside him. She was shorter than Voss, but everything about her bearing suggested a person who was always occupying exactly the amount of space she intended to occupy, no more, no less. She had dark eyes and the habit of going very still when she was thinking hardest, which meant she spent a great deal of time appearing motionless. She had designed most of this, not the ships, not the weapons, the thinking, the trap's geometry, the way the lanes were sealed, the way 94 ships could make 420 feel like they were surrounded on every side simultaneously. The human fleet did not fight in a line.
It did not hold a defensive wall or advance in formation or follow any of the tactical models Savar's systems were built to predict and counter. It fragmented into mobile strike groups, small, fast, coordinated, and moved continuously. From behind moons, out of the plane of the ecliptic, through gaps in the asteroid belt that Bren had pre-calculated as blind spots in Vathari's sensor arrays. Every time Savar's fleet tried to consolidate and face one group, two others hit them from angles they hadn't finished accounting for. His tactical systems kept recalculating. They kept being wrong. Not by large margins, by small ones. But small and wrong consistently adds up the same way all consistent things add up. Far below the main engagement, on the surface of a moon that Savar's fleet had assessed as empty, Corporal Taja Wren was running. She was leading her unit through a pressurized maintenance corridor at full sprint while a conclave landing party pushed through the far end. The landing had been unplanned on the conclave side. A small detachment had misread their tactical update and assumed the moon was ungarrisoned. That assumption was incorrect. Wren's unit was 14 people. The conclave party was 23. The conclave soldiers were physically larger, faster, and wearing armor rated to stop standard kinetic rounds at close range. Their weapons fired focused plasma packets that punched through bulkheads. Wren pulled her unit into a side maintenance bay, spoke quickly and quietly for 40 seconds while pointing to a schematic on her wrist display, and distributed assignments. 3 people took a drainage access tunnel that ran beneath the corridor and came out behind the conclave formation. 4 people set up at opposite ends of the main corridor with smoke charges and a reflective panel stripped from a storage bay wall. It would scatter human sensor targeting, which relied on thermal differential at close range. The remaining 7, including Wren, went up through a ceiling access grid with magnetic clamps and waited. The conclave soldiers moved into the corridor. The smoke detonated. The panel threw their sensor targeting sideways. The 3 people in the drainage tunnel came up through a floor grate at the formation's rear. The 7 in the ceiling came down. It was over in less than 2 minutes. None of the landing party returned to their ship. Wren sat against the corridor wall afterward and sealed a cut across her forearm with a field patch. Across from her, the youngest member of her unit, a soldier named Wes Choi,
19 years old and still wearing an expression of mild surprise every time something worked, was catching his breath with his back against the wall. "That actually worked," Wes said. "I know it worked. I designed it." "Right, yeah," he nodded slowly. "Okay." Back in space, in a secure databay deep inside the Endurance, Dr. Priya Caelum was watching her weapons perform. She was not a soldier. She wore a gray technical coat and kept a running notebook open beside her terminal at all times, which she filled with observations in handwriting so small it was almost illegible to anyone who wasn't her. She had spent the past 18 months at a facility buried under the Atacama, a desert she had found beautiful in a way that was very difficult to explain to people who had never been there, running stress tolerance simulations on kinetic impact behavior against energy dispersion shielding. The weapons her team had developed were simple in concept: dense, elongated projectile rounds fired from electromagnetic rail systems at velocities most species considered physically impractical. The fleet crews had named them bolts. Caelum hadn't named them anything. She'd spent a week being mildly annoyed by the name before deciding it was probably accurate. Conclave shielding was built around energy absorption. The Vithari and their allied species had spent centuries optimizing their defensive systems against the weapons their own civilizations used: plasma discharge, directed radiation, high-frequency coherent light. Every Conclave warship was heavily armored against every kind of directed energy weapon that Conclave warships fired at each other. No one had seriously considered a physical object moving fast enough to simply ignore the dispersion equation entirely. The physics weren't secret. The engineering wasn't exotic. It simply hadn't occurred to anyone that a species would invest that heavily in mass and velocity when energy weapons were so much cleaner to manufacture. Caelum had thought about it. Then she built a prototype. Then she built 6,000 more and distributed them across the human fleet over the preceding year. On her display, shield failure reports came in from Savar's ships. Not overload, not burn-through, structural collapse. The shield simply buckled under momentum the way a wall buckles when the thing hitting it is moving faster than the wall was designed to absorb. She watched the numbers and wrote in her notebook in small, careful letters. The word she wrote first was confirmed. Savar lost 61 ships before he ordered the retreat. He managed the withdrawal well. He was a professional, and professionals, especially surprised ones, know how to move. His fleet pulled back in good order, better than many would have managed under the same conditions. He had not panicked. He assessed, recalculated, and moved. He filed his report to the Conclave within the hour. He wrote it without excuses and without unnecessary language. They were waiting for us. The corridor was a prepared position. Their tactical model does not correspond to any doctrine in our records. Their weapons appear to target structural integrity rather than energy systems. Mechanism unclear but consistent across observed impacts. Their forces demonstrated independent operational capability at every scale of engagement, from fleet to unit. I can offer no precedent for comparison. He paused for a long time before writing the final line. Then he wrote it. I recommend we not proceed as if we understand what we are facing. In the conclave chamber, Thesson received the report. He read it 3 times. Then he put it down on his desk and looked at nothing in particular for a while. The word stabilization sat somewhere in the back of his mind like a door that had opened onto the wrong room. He called an emergency session for the following morning. The session lasted 7 hours. Most of it was argument. Some delegates wanted to immediately suspend the campaign and open direct diplomatic contact. Some wanted to send a larger fleet, 5 times the size, overwhelming force, no more subtlety. Some wanted to do both simultaneously, which several senior delegates pointed out was not a coherent strategy, and said so at considerable volume. The argument about whether the third option was coherent consumed nearly an hour on its own. Thesson let it run. He was old enough to know that a frightened room, rushed, only becomes a louder frightened room. When the arguments had exhausted themselves, he spoke. The campaign would not be withdrawn. The Conclave had 31 civilizations watching. 400 years of authority rested on the credibility of its decisions. One failed engagement did not change the strategic reality, it complicated it. Withdrawing now after a single action would communicate something about the Conclave's resolve that could not be unsaid. The campaign would escalate, not with more of the same, with everything. The vote passed. Even Osun voted yes. She sat very still afterward, as if she had agreed to something she already understood the full cost of. The second armada would take 6 months to assemble. 1,400 ships, pulled from the fleets of 11 member civilizations. Supply vessels, troop carriers, long-range bombardment platforms, and at the center of the formation, the ship the Conclave had not deployed in 300 years. The Eternal Resolve. It was not, technically, a ship in the conventional sense. It was the size of a small moon. It moved slowly, without urgency, with the complete assurance of something that had never needed to move quickly. Its shields drew from a contained fusion lattice the size of a mid-sized city. Its primary weapons system, the dissolution array, had been used exactly once in the Conclave's history, 300 years ago, against a civilization that had refused terms. That civilization's homeworld was now a smooth, airless sphere. No atmosphere, no name, just coordinates in a file that almost no one opened. Savar was given command again. He accepted it without comment. He spent the 6 months reading The Weight They Carry. The Eternal Resolve arrived at the edge of the Sol system alone. It did not need an escort. It moved the way very large, very certain things move, slowly, without apology, with the specific confidence of something that has never had cause to fear anything in its operational history. On the deep space sensor grid, it occupied a return signature that would normally represent a small natural satellite. Its transit had taken longer than a standard warship, but the Conclave had not considered speed relevant. Speed was for things that needed to outrun consequences. The Resolve carried its consequences with it. Grand Arbiter Thesson made the broadcast himself. His voice traveled across every open human communication channel, military, civilian, deep space relay, surface networks on Earth, and every colony. Every receiver that could receive a signal received it. Billions of people on dozens of worlds heard his voice arrive through speakers and earpieces and public screens and the small personal devices they carried in their pockets. He spoke calmly. He explained the dissolution array's capability, that it could strip a planet's atmosphere in under 8 hours. He explained it had been used before. He explained carefully what remained of the world it had been used on. He did not embellish. He did not need to. Then he offered terms. Surrender the fleet, surrender the colonial territories, accept Conclave administrative authority, and decommission all military systems. Do all of this within 12 hours, and the array would not be activated. He used the word mercy. He appeared to believe it. On Earth, in a city on the eastern coast of a continent that had once been called Africa, a woman named Yara stood in her kitchen with her hand pressed flat against her mouth and her eyes fixed on the small screen on the wall. She was thinking about her son, who was somewhere far out in deep space right now, probably on a ship she had never seen the inside of, probably doing something dangerous, probably, she told herself, not as afraid as he should be. On a station orbiting one of Jupiter's smaller moons, Corporal Taja Wren heard the broadcast through the unit comm while she was field stripping her rifle. She listened to the whole thing without stopping. When it ended, she finished the reassembly with practiced hands and set the rifle across her knees. Her soldier, Wes Choi, was sitting across from her. He was not doing anything, just sitting, which is unusual for him. "What do we do?" he asked. Wren looked at him. "We wait for orders, then we carry out the orders." Wes nodded slowly. "And if the orders are frightening? Then we carry out the orders and talk about it afterwards. That's the job." Wes was quiet for a moment. Okay. Yeah, okay. On the Endurance, Arkin Voss read Thessen's broadcast on his display and set it aside. He called Priya Cael first.
"Tell me the array has a weakness," he said. Cael was in her workspace, surrounded by technical documents, internal conclave schematics that had arrived through an encrypted channel 3 weeks earlier, sent without greeting or signature by a contact Voss had not expected to hear from. She had a stylus in one hand and notes on both sides of 4 sheets of paper. She did not answer immediately. She turned 2 more pages first. "The array requires a cooling cycle," she said finally. 18 minutes between full discharges. The weapon uses a contained plasma column to generate the beam. After each full discharge, the column has to be restabilized before it can fire again. During that window, the power routed to the array drops to near zero. What happens to the ship's other systems during the window? The shield lattice draws from the same power web. She paused. During the cycle, shield output drops to approximately 28%. Voss was quiet. "That's still significant protection," Cael said. "But not complete." "No, not complete." Voss was quiet for another moment. "That's enough," he said. He called a meeting of all senior commanders. They gathered in the main briefing room of the Endurance. Admirals, generals, senior captains, some in person, some on screen from other ships. He stood at the head of the table and told them the plan. The room got loud. These were not soft people. They were not easily alarmed. They had spent the past 8 months fighting a war they were outnumbered to fight and had not flinched. But what Voss described was not just difficult. The plan required sending the first 3 wings of the fleet, 48 ships, directly at the Eternal Resolve at full advance speed, in full sensor visibility, with no cover and no tactical deception. The purpose was not to damage the Resolve. The purpose was to absorb the first array discharge, measure the exact timing of the cooling cycle, document the power fluctuation signature, and give Cael the data she needed to coordinate the second and third waves. The first wave was not expected to return. Commander Liat Bren said nothing for a long moment after Voss finished. Then she said, "I'll lead it." "No," Voss said, immediately, without pause. "I outrank this refusal. I know that." They moved the rest of the conversation to his private office. The other commanders stayed in the briefing room, sitting or standing, not talking much. The door was not quite soundproof. No one could make out words, but the voices carried through it, back and forth, sharp and firm, and neither of them yielding, for 13 minutes. When the door opened, Bren came out first. She walked to her seat and sat without looking at anyone. Her face gave nothing away. Voss came out a few seconds after. He looked at the room. "The first wave moves in 20 minutes, he said. "Captain Hale Das and Commander Yiva Srin will lead it. I spoke with them before this meeting." He paused. "They volunteered." No one said anything. 20 minutes later, 48 ships turned and moved toward the Eternal Resolve. Cael watched from her data station, instruments running, hands steady on the edge of her console. The first wave flew straight and fast and did not waver. The array's fire charged. Sensors showed the power buildup over 34 seconds, and then it fired. In space, it was silent. On the display, the beam appeared almost gentle, a long, slow, diffuse light. 27 ships became brief white expansions, and then nothing. The remaining 21 scattered, drawing secondary fire, buying Cael the last seconds of timing data she needed. She had what she needed before the minute was over. She sent the cycle timing to the second and third wave commanders without speaking. They already knew what to do. The second wave moved in tight formation, timed to the exact gap, and drove into the Resolve's port power nodes with bolt rounds at maximum velocity. The shields buckled, held, but buckled. The third wave came in on the same nodes, same timing. 2 passes, 4 passes, 8. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of timed waves, of adjustment and loss and movement.
Human ships were lost in each pass, not to the array, which could fire once per cycle, but to the resolve secondary weapons, which were numerous and precise. The names that would need to be added to the wall on the Endurance's central corridor grew with each hour, and everyone on the ship knew it, and no one stopped. The power nodes failed. Then the shield lattice flickered. Then the bolt rounds began reaching the hull directly, and the hull began to fail in sections, and the fusion lattice at the ship's core lost coherence. The eternal resolve did not explode. It came apart, slowly, section by section going dark, then cold, then drifting. The fusion web collapsed inward before it could discharge outward, which Cael had calculated was the most probable outcome, though she had not been completely certain until it happened. She let out a slow breath that she had been holding for the past most of the hour. On every human ship and station and colony that had a live feed, the moment the Resolve's lights went out was met first with silence, then with the particular kind of noise that comes from a very large number of people who have been very tense for a very long time and have just been given permission to release it. In the Endurance's bridge, Voss watched the display. No one spoke to him for a long moment. He stood at the observation window and looked at the space where the largest ship ever deployed against humanity had just finished dying. Bren came and stood beside him. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They just stood there, the two of them, looking at the dark where something enormous had been. The names on the wall in the corridor behind them were still there. They would always be there. That was the point. Far away in the conclave chamber, Thesson received the report. He read it. He set it down. He sat in his high seat above the empty chamber floor and looked at the faintly glowing walls for a very long time. Around him, the station kept its constant hum, the sound of systems maintaining themselves, the sound of something enormous, still running. But something in the room had shifted, something structural. He had called humanity unstable. He had voted to stabilize them. He understood now, sitting alone in the quiet, that he had misread the word entirely. They were not unstable. They were the only species he had ever encountered that looked at the worst thing imaginable, that absorbed it, counted the cost of it, wrote the names of it on a wall, and then stood back up and kept going. That was not instability. That was something the Conclave did not have a word for. He would spend a long time thinking about what the correct word might be.
Seeds in the dark. 6 months before the Eternal Resolve had ever left its dock, Dr. Priya Cael had written a theoretical paper. She had written it in 3 days, mostly at night, in the small hours when the facility under the Atacama was quiet and the ventilation systems cycled down to their minimum hum. She had been thinking about the problem of scale. Not the tactical scale, ship against ship, formation against formation, but the deeper scale. The Conclave had 31 civilizations contributing to its military capacity. Humanity had 1. The math of attrition played out over a long enough timeline only went one direction. So she had thought about corridors. Faster-than-light transit required what physicists called geometric stability in the local space-time structure, a region of space where the underlying curvature was predictable enough to allow the field equations to resolve properly. Transit corridors were, in essence, the places in the galaxy where that stability existed naturally. They were not infinite. They were specific, mapped, known to every civilization that used them, which meant they could be closed. Not destroyed, not made dangerous, just closed. The way a door that doesn't open is not dangerous. It simply doesn't open. Cael's design was called Project Hollow. The devices were small, smaller than a ground vehicle. They ran cold and dark, drawing power from compressed fuel cells that could sustain them for 18 months. Each device carried a local space-time resonance emitter, a component whose underlying physics had been understood for decades but never developed into a practical application because no one had needed to do what she was doing.
When clustered with 300 or more identical devices in a defined region of space, the combined resonance output could destabilize the geometric conditions necessary for FTL. Not permanently, not catastrophically, just persistently, for as long as the devices were active. She had launched the first cluster 12 months before the Resolve was deployed. 47 clusters in total, each one traveling slow and dark on minimal fuel, pushed by light pressure sails across the long distances to 5 major transit corridors that Conclave warships used as primary approach lanes. The fleet crews called them seeds. Cael called them patience made material. They were already in position when the Second Armada began to move. While Voss watched the Armada's approach on the deep space grid, Commander Liat Bren was managing something else entirely. She was managing 17 simultaneous operations across 11 star systems, all of them targeting Conclave supply infrastructure. Not destroying it, crippling it. Fuel processing platforms hit with precision strikes and left damaged rather than gone. A damaged facility requires resources to repair. A destroyed one is simply replaced. Resupply convoys rerouted by false beacon signals that Cael's team had synthesized from captured Conclave hardware. Food and material shipments delayed by 1 week, then 2, then 4. By the time the Second Armada was 2/3 of the way to Seoul, it was already hungry. Its fuel reserves were below optimal. Its replacement parts inventory was running against demand. Its crews were not aware of the full picture, but Savar was, and he noted it in his operational log with the particular terseness of a professional who understands that noting a thing and solving a thing are not always the same operation. His analysts told him the disruptions were likely human action, but the methods were inconsistent. Sometimes electronic interference, sometimes physical sabotage, sometimes what appeared to be logistical errors that might have been accidents. The inconsistency was, of course, the point.
Bren had instructed every team to make each operation look different from the last. She called it noise in the dark. You could not trace what did not have a shape. You could not counter what did not have a pattern. It was during the 4th month of the Armada's approach that Riva Selene received a message. She was staying on a civilian transit station at the neutral edge of explored space. Technically neutral, technically safe, practically neither in any way that mattered. She had been there since the Conclave vote, maintaining the encrypted contact network she had spent years building, speaking carefully with people she was not allowed to be speaking with in channels that did not officially exist. The message came through one of those channels. She almost didn't recognize the sender identifier. When she did, she sat still for a moment. It was Osun. The message had no greeting, no signature, just a block of text and a set of attached files. They will use the Resolve. You don't understand what that means yet. You need to. The files were internal Conclave records, technical documentation, the kind that was not supposed to leave the Conclave's secure archive, the kind that described, in precise engineering language, what the dissolution array was designed to do. Riva read them quickly, then slowly, the way you read something when you want to be sure you understood it correctly the first time and are privately hoping you did not. She sat back in her chair. The room was very quiet. She forwarded everything to Voss. Voss read the files at his desk on the Endurance in the late ship cycle hours when most of his crew was at rest. He read without pausing. When he finished, he placed the display face down on the desk and looked at the wall for a while. He had known the Resolve was coming. He had known it was large and armored and powerful. He had prepared for a very large, very armored, very powerful ship. He had not known about the array. He had not known what it had done to that nameless world 300 years ago. He had not known about the smooth, airless sphere with no atmosphere at a set of coordinates that almost no one ever opened. He sat alone in the quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the display and sent one message to Cael. "How ready is Hollow?" Her reply came back in 3 minutes.
It's been ready for 4 months. He read that twice. Then he thought about everything Cael had built, the bolt rounds, the hollow network, the 18 months of quiet preparation that had preceded the first shot of the war by a considerable margin. He thought about the Bren's supply disruptions, running in 17 directions simultaneously for 4 months. He thought about the asteroid belt that his navigators had turned into a weapon. None of it had been reactive. All of it had been waiting. He thought about the 4 words Riva had spoken into a communicator, the 3 words he had sent back, and the long, quiet machinery that had already been in motion by the time either of them said anything at all. The Conclave had called humanity unpredictable. He understood, sitting there in the late cycle quiet, that they had confused unpredictability with preparation. They had seen the outcomes without understanding the work that preceded them. They had read the ship count, the colony population, the weapons yield, and they had not asked a simpler question. How long have these people been getting ready? The answer was, longer than anyone had been paying attention. Riva received a second message from Osun 3 days after the peace request arrived, a message she had not expected, from a sender she had not expected to hear from again. Osun had filed a formal notice of resignation from the conclave before the peace meeting. No speech, no public statement, just a filed document and a request for neutral status. Humanity granted it without hesitation. A journalist aboard a civilian human station requested an interview. Osun agreed. The journalist asked many questions. Near the end, she asked about human memorial practice, the walls, the named dead, the ceremonies. Conclave observers had called it inefficient. She asked what Osun thought. Osun was quiet for a moment. "It provides no tactical advantage," she said. Her voice was very even. "It does not improve weapons accuracy or hull integrity. It does not win engagements." She folded her hands. "That is precisely the point. Humans do not act only for tactical advantage. They act for each other. They carry their dead because it reminds them of what they are fighting for, and because they actively refuse to let those people disappear." She paused. "You cannot break a species that works that way. You can hurt them, you can make things very difficult for them, but you cannot break them, because the reason to continue is embedded in the people beside them. You cannot remove that reason without removing the people, and if you remove the people, there are always more people, and those people remember the ones you removed." The journalist was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you voted against the original resolution?" Osun said simply, "I voted against it because I had read their history, all of it, not the summary, the full record. And when you read the full record, the answer is not complicated." She looked out the station window at the stars. "They came out the other side of something. People who come out the other side of something like that do not lose to someone else."
The ceasefire request came through a standard diplomatic channel, the same kind used for trade boundary negotiations and the slow, careful management of civilizations trying to share the same galaxy without destroying each other's infrastructure. The message used formal language, the kind that had been developed over centuries specifically to drain feeling from difficult things, but the meaning was plain. The Galactic Conclave of Varric was requesting a cessation of hostilities. It was the first time in 400 years the Conclave had made that request rather than issued that command. Voss read it on the bridge of the Endurance. He said nothing for a long moment. He handed the display to Bren. She read it, handed it back, and looked out at the stars. Neither of them smiled. There was too much behind them for that. Too many ships that had gone out and not returned. Too many names on the wall. They had won, but winning had not been free, and they both understood that clearly enough to be quiet about it. The Hollow network was still active across 5 transit corridors.
The Second Armada's 1,400 ships, minus the Eternal Resolve and the vessels lost to human strikes over the preceding months, were sitting motionless in deep space, unable to advance through closed corridors, running low on fuel and supplies, receiving no reinforcement because the resupply routes Bren had spent months quietly breaking were still broken. Savar had held his fleet in formation as long as a professional could hold a fleet in a position that was no longer viable. A fleet without fuel is not a fleet. It is an expensive collection of objects that happen to be shaped like ships. The Conclave had no remaining moves. They had deployed their largest piece and lost it. The rest of the board was against them. Voss sent his reply in under an hour. Send Ambassador Solane your terms. She will be ready. Riva received the message while she was already in transit to the meeting station, a neutral platform in unclaimed space that she had selected and Thesson had accepted without objection. She had been preparing for this meeting for a long time. The document she carried was not something she had written in the past few days. It had been drafted quietly over months in the same careful and unhurried way that all the other pieces had been built. The hollow network, the belt mapping, the supply disruptions, all of it built with the understanding that at some point the fighting would have to become something else. That the goal was never just to win the war. The goal was to change the conditions that had made the war possible. She arrived first. She sat at the table in the center of the meeting room and waited. When Thesson entered, he looked different than she remembered. Not physically. He was still tall, still silver-robed, still carrying himself with the weight of someone who had held authority for a long time. But something in the way he held that weight had changed. He sat across from her, and his forearms settled at his sides, and he looked at her with eyes that were tired in a way that was not about sleep. There was a long silence. "You prepared this before the war began," he said, looking at the document on the table. "We prepared for a lot of things," Riva said. He picked it up and read. She let him. The document was not a peace treaty in the traditional sense. It did not simply draw boundaries and go home. It was longer than that. It proposed a restructuring of the conclave itself, every recognized spacefaring species in the explored galaxy to receive a seat, every seat to carry equal weight on matters of declaration and authorization. No body to authorize military action against another civilization without a full majority that included representation from the civilization under consideration. It was the thing she had wanted to say on the speaker's platform the day she had stood there for 2.5 hours and not been called. Thesson read it all the way through. He put it down. He looked at the wall for a moment. "You reduce conclave authority significantly," he said. "Yes," she said. "Many member civilizations will resist this." "Yes, but many others will not. And after what happened, the ones who resist will have to explain why to a room that is watching very carefully." He had nothing to say to that. He looked at the document again. Outside the meeting room's single narrow window, the stars were still and very far away, the way stars always are, patient and indifferent, and entirely unconcerned with the business of the beings below them. Thesson picked up the stylus on the table. He signed it. That evening, on the Endurance, Archon Voss walked the ship's corridors alone. It was late in the ship's cycle. Most of the crew was at rest. The light in the corridors was low and warm, the kind of light that makes a space feel smaller in a way that is not unpleasant. He walked slowly, not going anywhere particular, just moving through the ship the way you sometimes need to move through a place to understand what it has become. He passed the wall. It was a plain section of corridor near the ship's geometric center, the same gray metal as everything else around it, but the names covered it now,
written by hand in careful letters, added one by one as reports came in over the past months. Each entry in the handwriting of whoever had known them best. Some entries had small notes underneath, a rank, a post, a last remembered thing. Voss stood in front of it for a while. He did not say anything out loud. He just stood. He read some of the names, the ones he knew personally, the ones he knew only by report, the ones he had sent messages about to families on worlds he had never seen. He stood there long enough that his feet grew tired and he didn't move. Then he walked back to his quarters and sat down and did not sleep for a long time. In the newly restructured conclave chamber, a construction team added a new seat to the ring in the week after the signing. It was simpler than the others, plain metal, no decorative detail. Above it, technicians mounted a small plaque. The text had been requested by Osun, who had returned not as a delegate, but as an observer, an independent voice, a position that had not previously existed and been created specifically for her at the request of several newly seated member species who had read the record of her vote and wanted her in the room. The plaque was translated into all recognized languages of the conclave, and then into several more. In the common human language, it read, "We were here, we remained, we will not be moved." The chamber was empty while the work was done. The seats were quiet. The walls glowed their faint blue, the same blue they had glowed for 600 years, the same as they had on the day Riva Solan had stood on the podium and not been called. The station turned slowly around its star. The stars outside were still and cold. But something in the room was different now, something structural. The way the weight of a place changes when the people inside it have finally, genuinely been forced to understand something they spent a long time not understanding. It was not peace, not yet. Peace takes longer to build than a war takes to start. There were civilizations in the conclave that were not satisfied. There were beings who believed the new framework would fail. There was work ahead, slow, careful, argumentative, uncertain work that would take years, possibly decades, and would never be fully finished. But it was a beginning, and beginnings, held to carefully enough, can become something real. Riva Solan thought about that on the transport home. She sat at the window and looked out at the dark between the stars, all that empty, patient space. She thought about the first time she had stood on the speaker's platform and waited for 2.5 hours without being called. She thought about the 3 words she had spoken into a communicator in a corridor with amber light and a deep, constant hum. She thought about all the people who had been working, quietly and in parallel, long before anyone fired a single shot. Cael running simulations in the desert. Bren drawing trap geometries on a whiteboard in a facility no one knew existed. Voss drinking coffee in a room full of maps and quiet officers, waiting for a signal he had always known was coming. And Wes Choi sitting against a corridor wall with his rifle and his mild expression of surprise, learning, probably still learning, that the job sometimes asked you to do things that frightened you, and that the correct response to that was to do them anyway and talk about it after. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. The stars were very far away. They were always very far away. That had never stopped anyone. He closed his eyes. Back home, somewhere on a moon orbiting Jupiter, Taja Wren was cleaning her rifle again, out of habit now, not necessity. The war was over. She would be discharged soon, a form and a handshake and a transport home. She was thinking about what home looked like now, whether the same streets would feel the same. She decided they probably wouldn't. She decided that was probably fine. Somewhere on a planet with a clear morning and street vendors and traffic and people walking too fast, a young man named Wes Choi would step off a transport in a few weeks and stand in the open air and breathe for the first time in months and feel very quietly that he had come out the other side of something. He wouldn't be wrong. And in deep space, across 5 cold transit corridors, the Hollow network received the deactivation signal. One by one, the seeds went dormant. Their resonance emitters powered down. Their light sails collapsed. Their long, quiet, patient work finally finished. They drifted in the dark between stars, invisible, forgotten, already irrelevant. They had done exactly what they were made to do. They had waited. They had held. They, at the right moment, simply closed the door, which, in the end, was all that had ever been needed.